it's going to be story time, Shiva story time, my very, very favorite, at least at the moment, Shiva story. And I've really been thinking about this story a lot the last couple of days in light of the very intense astrological configurations happening right now. You may be feeling the volatility in your body, in your life, in the world, in your heart in particular, even pain manifesting or expressing in your rib cage, heart region, back of your heart, into your shoulders, and maybe even into your neck right now, because that region is actually getting kind of inflamed, intensified with some heat and volatility and activity right now. And it's also a time in which Jupiter has just gone retrograde. And Jupiter is a very benevolent planet to do with expansion and wisdom and good advice and wealth in all of its forms, and the guru, teacher, mentor principle, and sacred study, and so on. So that's happening at the same time as this volatility, all with this heavy dose of the retrograde Saturn that I've talked about in a previous video, which intensifies seriousness, strangeness, weirdness, oddness, the feeling of isolation and standing alone, rigidity, but also is connected to ancient wisdom, particularly the wisdom of India and the Vedic tradition and of yoga. So lots of things converging right now. And I think that if I were to sum up what's happening astrologically right now for the next month and continuing into late into this year, it is a time of spiritual tests, and it is an opportunity for us to be polished. But polishing is not a comfortable endeavor much of the time. So, welcome to Story Time. And I'm very looking forward to sharing the story of Arjuna and the Kirat. All right? Okay. So, the story of Arjuna, the warrior, the most famous archer of his time, perhaps of all time, the most skilled archer with a bow and arrow, who fought the war of the Mahabharata, that Dharma Yuddha, the dharmic war, who was advised and taught by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita right before that war of the Mahabharata. This is a story of that Arjuna meeting his match in a Kirat, which is a hunter, a tribal hunter. Okay? So, in this particular point of the Mahabharata, the story, the Pandavas, that's Arjuna and his brothers, the 5 Pandavas, they're living in the forest, having been banished, and they're with their wife and kind of waiting out their time. And they're visited by the Rishi Vedvyasa. And Vedvyasa asks them how they're spending their time. And he advises them that they need to spend their time preparing for the Dharma Yuddha that is to come, the dharmic war. This is a war that essentially they have tried to avoid in many peaceful ways and in strategic ways. And it's at the point where this Dharma Yuddha has to happen in order to protect humanity from the poisons of greed, rage, revenge, and so on. So, Vedvyasa visits them in the forest and advises them that they need to prepare. And he initiates Arjuna, who is the greatest of the warriors and the greatest archer. He initiates him in a special mantra and then tells him to propitiate Shiva with devotion and with this mantra on Mount Indrakila, which is a high point in the Himalayas, to propitiate Shiva in order to be eligible to receive the Pashupatastra. So Pashupati is Shiva and Astra is weapon. Okay, so the Pashupatastra is a celestial weapon. It is the most powerful of all of the celestial weapons, and it is really wielded only by Shiva, Kali, and Adipara Shakti, the great divine feminine force. And this Astra can be discharged, it is said, through sight, so through the eyes, through mantra, through thought, and through a bow, so through devotion. And it is said that this is an astra that should never be used unless absolutely necessary because of its intense destructive force. So, Arjuna wisely takes the advice of his teacher, of this rishi who has advised him. So he takes Vedvyasa's advice, and that's the first good step. Get wise counselors and take their wise counsel. And so he gets to Mount Indrakila to do his tapasya, and immediately when he arrives, he makes himself a little hut to stay in, and he makes a Shivalingam out of the clay, out of the earth that's there in the mountain. And he begins to pray daily, intensively, season after season after season, decorating the Shivalingam with offerings of flowers and forest fruits, and bowing and standing on one foot and reciting this mantra through all of the intensities of rain and ice storms and wind and intense heat and drought and so on. And in fact, the intensity of his tapasya is impacting the whole realm that he's in. That whole forest is being affected by the heat of his intense devotional practice. And Shiva himself even hears of what's happening. And so, one day in the midst of this intense sadhana, Arjuna looks up and he sees a wild boar fiercely running straight towards him and straight toward the Shivalingam. And he thinks maybe this boar is in fact an asura that is wanting to distract him from his devotion to Shiva, or is maybe wanting revenge on Arjuna because perhaps Arjuna had killed some of his asura relatives in the past. Either way, this boar is running straight towards him. And so, of course, with the swiftness of the refined warrior that he is, he immediately, in less than a moment, grabs his bow and arrow and shoots an arrow right into the throat of the boar that's running toward him. And the boar immediately falls to the ground. And so Arjuna approaches the dead boar, and then he looks and he sees there are two arrows in the boar. There's the one he shot in the throat, and there's the one in the rear. And so he looks up, and there he sees, on the other side of the boar, he sees a kirat, a hunter, a tribal hunter, and he's standing there with his bow over his shoulder, and he's surrounded by many kirat women, many huntresses. And the kirat said, "Back away, that's my boar." And Arjuna says, "No, I clearly killed the boar." And the kirat says, "No, your arrow went into a dead boar. I killed the boar, and I'm taking this boar to feed my family. And if you want it, you'll have to fight me for it." Now, Arjuna is not interested in keeping the boar at all. But one thing to know about Arjuna is he, at times, suffers from a lack of humility. And he also suffers from insecurity. Have you noticed these things tend to go together? So he's a little bit insecure that someday someone might outdo him as a warrior. And he lacks humility. And so it just takes this invitation from the kirat. And Arjuna thinks it's a bit amusing that this tribal hunter thinks that he could possibly win over Arjuna in a battle. And anyway, he thinks maybe he'll teach this kirat a lesson in humility himself. And so he says, "Yes, let's fight for it. And they immediately stand back and they face each other and they draw their arrows back in the bows and they begin to just let their arrows fly. And Arjuna surrounds that Kirat in some arrows, and the Kirat easily dodges them, and the Kirat lets fly some more arrows, and Arjuna easily dodges them. They seem to be matched. Now, Arjuna's been holding back a little bit. So he takes it a little more seriously. Now he sees, oh, this hunter seems to know at least a little bit. I don't know where he got this skill, but he's not bad. So Arjuna stands a little more firmly, and he lets fly more arrows in quick succession. And that Kirat, he lets fly arrows immediately back, and that Kirat's arrows split Arjuna's arrows in half. And now they're going back and forth with the arrows, and Arjuna's becoming exhausted and frustrated and confused. He's never fought anyone like this. And finally, that Kirat lets fly an arrow that in fact knocks the bow right out of Arjuna's hands. Arjuna, he is completely identified as the archer, and he's separated from his bow, which is always on him. And this throws him off for just a moment, but then he quickly draws his sword and he begins attacking that Kirat with the sword. And the Kirat takes out a little hunter's knife from his belt, and he's able to block the warrior's sword with that little hunter's knife. And they're back and forth, and they're matched, even though that Kirat's sword is so small, that little knife. And finally, the Kirat with this hunter's sword slices Shiva's sword in half. So half is over there, half is left in his hand. Arjuna tosses it, and they ultimately begin fighting then hand-to-hand combat. So now they're wrestling on the ground, and they're rolling around, and they're punching each other with full force. Their fighting on the ground is making the whole earth shake. Now, Arjuna's at a loss, utterly confused and frustrated. And at a certain point, that Kirat kicks Arjuna, and Arjuna rolls back, and the wind is knocked out of him, and he feels he doesn't know what to do, and he retreats back a little further, and he turns and goes toward that Shiva lingam that he's been praying to all of these seasons, and he falls at his feet in front of the Shiva lingam, and there's some flowers there that had been prepared for his devotional practices, for his tapasya, and he gathers them up, and he quickly begins decorating that Shiva lingam with the flowers, and he begins praying, and he's whispering to the Shiva lingam, please, what's happening? What is this? I don't understand. Where's my skill? Where's my strength? Help me, help me. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. And then he turns around and he's approaching that Kirat again, ready to give it one more try. He can't possibly imagine giving up. And as he's approaching the Kirat, he sees that on the Kirat's head, on the hunter's head, are the flowers that he had just placed on the Shiva lingam. Immediately, Arjuna drops down to his knees, and he puts his head on the feet of the hunter. He knows immediately, this must be Shiva. There's no other explanation. And he begins crying. His tears are flowing on to the hunter's feet. And as the tears touch his feet, Shiva gives up his disguise as a hunter, and he reveals his true form as Shiva. And then Arjuna looks up and he sees this is indeed Pashupat. This is Shiva. And then he looks around and he sees all the Kirat women have also dropped their disguises. And one of those Kirat women is Parvati, Mother Parvati. And all of the others are all of Shiva's Ganas who had also asked to take form as Kirat women so that they could join Shiva and witness this great battle between Shiva and Arjuna. And Arjuna begs for Shiva's forgiveness. He's feeling guilt and shame. He had been fighting the very one to whom he had been praying. And Shiva immediately puts Arjuna at ease, and he says, don't worry. This was a test to see your skill, your devotion, your commitment, and your humility as well. So now, you have passed the test. Tell me, what boon do you seek? And Arjuna says to Shiva, with tears still in his eyes, head bowed, he says that he is seeking glory on earth with success in the Dharma Yuddha. And he asks to be given the impossible gift of the irresistible, divine, celestial weapon, the Pashupatastra. And Shiva says, oh, son of Kunti, which is a great way to respect a warrior, is that you name the name of the warrior's mother, the divine feminine. O son of Kunti, I will bestow this weapon on you. I had to test you first. I had to make sure you're ready and worthy of it. And I see now you are capable of wielding it when no other human being ever has been. You are capable of wielding it. However, you must only use this Pashupatastra against celestial fighters. Your devotion has shown humility, that you will be capable of respect and restraint. Never release this weapon, this astra, against a human enemy, or it will destroy the whole creation. Nothing that moves and nothing that doesn't move can possibly withstand its force. And the possession of this weapon, though it was never wielded by Arjuna, did make him invincible. So, this is the story of Arjuna and the Kirat, who was really Shiva in disguise. And to me, it's a story that reminds us that skill is absolutely necessary. We must be skillful if we wish to be successful in any endeavor. Skill is a must. And we continually develop that skill. Maybe it's a physical skill, maybe it's a skill of speech, maybe it's a skill of your mind, maybe it's a skill of kindness. But skill alone is not enough. We also need the ability to listen to wise counsel, to recognize and discern wise counsel, gurus, mentors, teachers, and then listen to their wisdom, to their advice. That's essential. And devotion is essential. And this is a story that reminds us of the experience of spiritual tests. That what we think we are fighting, what we think is against us or we are against, in fact, is a form of the divine. We often pray to the divine to make things we don't like or want go away. But in fact, those things that we don't like or want may be a form of the divine coming to us, moving towards us, working its way through us, offering us tests and lessons that refine us and polish us. Remember, polishing is uncomfortable. And I hope that this story is something that is helpful now and that you can return to remember that as someone who takes on a life of spiritual growth, you are also taking on spiritual tests that polish you. And that this is a time astrologically in which many of us are experiencing that. And it's a good time to remember the lessons of spiritual tests, the lesson of developing skill where we need skills, the lesson of getting wise counsel and listening to that wise counsel, the lesson of devotion to the divine. There's an expression, it's a tantrika expression that brings in the name of Shiva. Na shivam vidyate kvachit. Na shivam vidyate kvachit. And it is essentially, there is nothing that is not Shiva. There is nothing that is not the divine. I hope that this story and its meaning helps. I hope that we can remember that what we resist may be a spiritual test being given by the divine as part of our growth, our journey, and that devotion always helps. Always helps. Hara Hara Mahadev. Om Namah Shivaya.